Two people are handed the same offer. One accepts it, one refuses it. Neither of them is braver than the other, and neither of them is the better talker. They're measuring the offer against different things. This is a video about the thing you're supposed to measure it against, where the idea came from, what the research says about it, and how to turn it into a number you can carry into a room. There's a failure this concept was built to prevent. An offer arrives. You compare it to what you hoped for, and it's lower, so it feels like a loss. Or you compare it to what you feared, and it's higher, so it feels like a win. Both comparisons are to numbers that live in your head. Neither of them tells you whether accepting it is better than not accepting. The only comparison that answers that question is the comparison to no deal. Every agreement competes against one specific rival, and that rival is what happens to you if this conversation ends without an agreement. If the deal on the table beats that outcome, taking it makes you better off. If it does not, signing makes you worse off than walking out of the room. Everything else in this video is the work of turning that sentence into a usable figure. So the term comes from the Harvard Negotiation Project and from Roger Fisher and William Ury's book, Getting to Yes, published in 1981, with Bruce Patton added as a co-author in later editions. BATNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. It was not proposed as a clever tactic. It was proposed as a replacement for something the authors thought negotiators were doing badly. The thing they wanted to replace was the bottom line. A bottom line is the worst outcome you decide in advance you'll accept. The objection to it is practical. It is chosen before the conversation starts, which means it's chosen while you know the least. It's frequently arbitrary. And once you've committed to a rigid figure, you stop looking for creative structures that might have satisfied both sides in some other way, because the only question left is whether the number clears the line. The authors put the alternative standard in one sentence. Fisher and Ury in Getting to Yes, page 104. The reason you negotiate is to produce something better. So they're saying better than what you could get without negotiating. That's the entire agreement for the concept. If the point of the exercise is to beat no agreement, then no agreement's the benchmark. That might not be the point, but it could be. So the standard is not a line you invent. It's a description of reality. Your best alternative is the specific course of action you will actually take if this negotiation produces nothing. Not the best thing that could theoretically happen. Not the average of your options. The single best one. The one you would really do priced honestly. Fisher and Ury added one piece of machinery on top of it. And it is the part a lot of people do sometimes skip. Set a tripwire slightly better than your alternative. The tripwire is not the point at which you refuse. It's the point at which you stop improvising and start deliberating, so that you notice you're approaching the edge before you've already stepped over it. In practice, this is the difference between walking away on purpose and realizing afterward that you should have. Let's think quickly on a working definition. Your best alternative to a negotiated agreement is the course of action you will take if no agreement is reached. And it is a course of action, not necessarily a number. The number comes later, when you price it. Keeping those two things separate matters, because a great deal of bad negotiating comes from people who have a number and no alternative behind it. Three things it is regularly confused with. It is not your target, which is what you're trying to get. It is not your opening offer, which is a tactical choice. And it is not a bottom line you set by deciding what feels acceptable, because that figure is produced by your mood and your patience, rather than by anything that exists outside the conversation. Laid out on a single scale, 4 different numbers are in play, and they sit in a fixed order. Your priced alternative sits at the bottom. Your reservation price, the point where you're indifferent between the deal and the alternative, sits just above it once you've added the cost of switching. Your target sits well above that. Your opening offer sits above your target because you expect movement. Confusing any two of these is how people concede to a floor they never actually had. Now put 2 negotiators on the same scale. Your reservation price and theirs define the zone of possible agreement. Any settlement inside that band leaves both sides better off than no deal. When the 2 reservation prices do not overlap, there is no zone, and no amount of skill produces an agreement that both sides should sign. Recognizing an empty zone early is a result, not a failure. It saves the time you would have spent negotiating toward a deal that could not exist. So the 4 terms side by side with what each one is and where it comes from and what changes it. The alternative changes when the outside world changes. The reservation price changes when the alternative changes or the costs of switching change. The target changes when you learn something about what is available. The opening offer changes when you decide it should. So now let's think about pricing the alternative. Step 1 is to list every course of action available to you if this deal dies. Write down the weak ones. A list of one option is not a list. And the exercise has a second purpose beyond producing candidates. It converts a vague feeling of having no choices into a visible inventory, which is usually less dire than the feeling suggested. Step 2 is to take the strongest item on that list and turn it from possible into real. A competing employer who might be interested is not an alternative. A written offer from that employee is. A second supplier you've heard of is not an alternative, but a quoted price from that supplier on paper is. This step is where nearly all of the available leverage in a negotiation is actually created, and this step happens before anyone sits down. Step 3 is the arithmetic, and it is the step that also gets skipped sometimes. Start with the gross value of the alternative. Subtract what it costs to switch to it. Subtract what the delay costs you. Then discount the remainder by the probability that it actually materializes. What is left is the number your deal has to beat. It's almost always lower than the headline figure of the alternative, and people who negotiate against the headline figure hold out for terms their alternative cannot support. Now worked through with numbers. A competing job offer pays $90,000. It starts in 3 months, and you would be unpaid for 2 of them. So subtract $15,000. It requires relocation you would pay for, so subtract $8,000. The offer is verbal, and the role is not funded until the next quarter, so call it 70% likely. 90 minus 15 minus 8 is 67, and 70% of 67 is around 47,000 of expected value. That is what the deal in front of you has to beat, not 90. The probability discount deserves its own look because it moves the number more than people expect. The same alternative, valued at the same gross figure, is worth what you see here at 90%, 70%, 50%, and 30% likelihood. An alternative you're not sure of is not a slightly weaker version of a certain one. It is a substantially different number, and it should produce substantially different behavior. Step 4. Set the tripwire above the walkway and write both figures down before the conversation starts. The reason to write them down is that the number drifts in the room. Time pressure, the pull of a counterpart you like, 3 hours of sunk effort, and the simple desire to be finished all move it in one direction. A figure recorded before any of those forces existed is the only version of your judgment that was made under clean conditions. The evidence that this matters is old and consistent. Pinkley, Neal, and Bennett, in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes in 1994, tested what alternatives do to outcomes in 2-party negotiations, and found that negotiators holding attractive alternatives claimed more value. Arunashalam in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology in 1998 ran the comparison across 603 participants in Hong Kong and the United States and found the same result in both, which tells you the effect is not an artifact of one bargaining culture. Pinkley, Neal, and Bennett also drew the practical conclusion, which is that negotiators should communicate and use their BATNAs to push for better agreements. Holding a strong alternative silently captures part of the benefit. Using it captures the rest. Now the finding that runs against the intuition. Michael Scherer, Roderick Schwab, and Adam Galinsky asked around 100 people a simple question. Would you rather negotiate a job offer holding a weak alternative or holding no alternative at all? More than 90% chose the weak alternative. Any option feels better than no option. Then they ran the negotiation. Published in Psychological Science in 2015, The result was the reverse of the preference. Negotiators with no alternatives felt less powerful, and they made higher first offers and secured better outcomes than negotiators who held a weak alternative. The people who felt weaker actually performed better. The author summarized it in 5 words. Absolute powerlessness can be psychologically liberating. That was from page 170 of Scherer, Schwab, and Galinsky's Psychological Science in 2015. The mechanism is anchoring. A weak alternative is a low number you're carrying. When you construct your first offer, that low number is the nearest reference point you have, so your offer drifts toward it. A negotiator with nothing has no low number to drift toward, so the offer gets built from the market, from the value of the work, or from ambition. The weak alternative did not weaken the negotiator's position. It weakened the negotiator's opening. The same paper contains the fix, established through moderation. When negotiators with weak alternatives were directed to focus on a countervailing anchor, the disadvantage disappeared. So the instruction is not to discard a weak alternative. Keep it, because it still sets your true floor. Just do not build your offer from it. Build the offer from the market rate, the comparable deal, or the value delivered, and let the alternative do the job it's actually for, telling you when to stop. One more result from the same research group, because it contradicts a common assumption. Scherer, Loschalder, and Schwab in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes in 2016 found that multiple weak alternatives can be worse than a single one. They call the effect bargaining zone distortion. Several mediocre options make a negotiator feel more powerful while giving that negotiator more low numbers to average against. And the feeling and the outcome move in opposite directions. Your alternative is half the picture. The relationship between the two alternatives determines what's possible. So estimate theirs. The signals are usually observable, how urgent their timeline is, how expensive it would be for them to switch, how much they have already invested in this specific arrangement, and how many other counterparts are genuinely available to them, and whether their deadline is external or self-imposed. You can get an idea of these things a lot of times without them even telling you anything. 4 combinations, 4 different games. Strong for you and weak for them. You can hold terms and should test whether they will meet them. Strong for both. The zone is narrow, and value comes from trading across issues rather than pushing on price. Weak for both. Both sides are pretending, and whoever discovers this first has the advantage. Weak for you and strong for them. Your work is not at the table. It is in improving the alternative before you sit down, or in changing what is being negotiated. There's also the alternative that doesn't exist yet. Pinkley, Conlon, Sawyer, Sleesman, Van de Waal, and Quincy published a study on this in 2019, titled The Power of Phantom Alternatives in Negotiation: How What Could Be Haunts What Is. A possible alternative that has not materialized still changes how negotiators behave. That cuts 2 ways. It is a reason to develop your own possibilities into something concrete, and it is a reason to check whether the pressure you're feeling comes from an alternative your counterpart actually holds, or one they've merely implied. So there are 3 rules about disclosure. Disclose a strong alternative specifically, because a vague claim of having options is treated as a bluff, but a named, verifiable one is not. Do not disclose a weak one, since it tells your counterpart exactly how little you can insist on. Never invent one, because an alternative you cannot produce is a claim that gets tested, and being caught costs you more than the leverage was worth. The alternative feeds the opening, and the opening is doing a great deal of work. A meta-analysis by Orr and Guthrie in 2005 reported a correlation of about 0.5 between opening offers and final outcomes. The number you say first is closely related to the number you end up with, which is why the anchoring point previously discussed matters as much as it does. There's a cost side, and current work is explicit about it. A 2025 meta-analytic experimental synthesis in organizational behavior and human decision processes, drawing on 374 effect sizes from 90 samples and over 16,000 people, found that more ambitious first offers do raise the counteroffer and the final price and also raise the likelihood of impasse and lower the counterpart's satisfaction with the outcome. Your priced alternative is what tells you how much impasse risk you can afford to buy. Now for running the number. For salary, the alternative is a written competing offer or the value of staying where you are, priced after tax, benefits, vesting you would forfeit, and commute. Improve it before the conversation by running the other process to a written offer, not by mentioning that you're looking. Now, if you don't have a competing offer, still do not build your ask from your current salary, because your current salary is exactly the weak anchor the 2015 research describes. Build it from market data for the role. For vendor renewals, leverage here is a function of time, and it decays. 12 months out, a competing quote is real, migration is feasible, and the alternative price as well. 30 days out, with an auto-renewal clause approaching and no evaluated replacement, the priced alternative is close to zero, regardless of how many competitors exist in the market. The alternative is not built during the renewal conversation. It's built 2 quarters before it. Now, what if you have no alternative and cannot create one? 3 moves that do not require leverage you do not have. Change what's on the table, since scope, timing, and term are negotiable when price is not. Anchor on something external, because market data and comparable deals are the countervailing anchor that research points to. And shorten the commitment, because a 12-month term instead of a 36-month term converts a bad deal into a decision you get to revisit while your position improves. Do 5 checks before you walk in. 1. Name the specific action you take if there is no deal. 2. Price it, with switching costs, delay, and probability all subtracted. 3. Set a tripwire above it. 4. Write both figures down. And 5. Decide where your opening comes from, and make sure the answer is not your alternative. The offer in front of you is not good or bad on its own. It is better or worse than the thing that happens if you say no. And until that thing has a number, you're just guessing. Price the alternative, and the walkaway decides itself. Please subscribe to my channel. I'll be putting out more of these videos in this negotiation series.